Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency Firebrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone. So please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, Firebrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, Firebrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Fired Up. I'm Morgan McClintock.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich.
And I'm Ian Lipner.
And today we have a slightly different format for you all that we're calling Burning Questions. And in this show today, we're going to be answering questions that we've had commonly from clients, from people that we talk to, and from our team, all about the topic of PR. So Chris, Ian, and I will be answering these questions. We hear these quite a lot. And we've put them all together, and I've put them in the bag that many will remember. That's our smart people, dumb questions bag, and it's a fresh set of questions. We'll see how many we get through today, but Chris and Ian, if you're ready, we'll dive in.
Fire away.
Okay. Should we announce our seed funding, or should we wait for Series A, Chris?
Like a lot of questions related to PR, the answer will be it depends, but the factors you have to consider there are the identity of the origin of the funding. Is this a VC with clout, with relationships, with reporters that reporters have covered before? The size of the seed could enter into it, but I think the biggest factor you need to consider is, do you have all the elements of a story together? At the seed, even more than any other round, reporters are going to be looking at the total package, because the amount is not likely to raise eyebrows on its own. It's really about whether you're introducing something. You can make the case that you're introducing something truly exciting and you're showing early traction. Early traction might even be the most important factor of all. The seed round, it's exploratory by nature. And so to qualify for coverage, you need some X factor. And there's no shame in not having the X factor right off the bat. Most startups don't. A lot of times, if you feel like you just don't have all the pieces, it really does make sense to sort of save your powder and get a good customer on board for a Series A, cultivate your relationships with potentially analysts if you're in that kind of market, or with your funding, with your investors, and just get everything ready for a really impactful Series A.
I think that's great advice. The one I have to factor in there is, if you feel competitive pressure as well, if you've got something that's genuinely novel and you want to get out there first, then that just helps you with your positioning. And so think through, okay, if somebody else was to announce is going to do something fairly similar, they might be even behind you, how would you feel about that? That might be another thing that would push you to kind of announce at seed rather than hold to A. You're going to have a better story to tell at the A because you've just got more traction. And another thing related to this is, in the ZERP period, we had companies get their seed, then get their A, then get their B, and C almost in 1 year at the peak. You have to have enough news story to tell when you're going to announce that next round, and the story has to have evolved. So again, if you feel like, okay, we've got the C, but we're really going to go for our A fairly quickly. We talked to a company recently that did that. You might as well wait because you'll have a better story.
That's a really good point. And I think it's worth actually, expanding on that a bit and thinking about what funding news is for and what it represents for the publications that cover it. Even reporters who do funding, frequently will acknowledge that it's what they call in the business a news hook, right? It's an excuse in a way to check in with a company or introduce a company and report the latest on its development and where it is in its trajectory. So that's a really good point, Morgan. If you expect to follow a seed round with an A round close behind, or maybe you raised the seed a while ago and you can see the A not too far off on the horizon, but you're thinking, well, maybe I'll get 2 bites at this. If you don't think you're going to be able to advance the story with the A, if you won't have anything more to show by the time of the A, then it really does make sense to hold for the A, because the A is going to be more important for you as a proof point for other investors, for employees and whatnot. You want to put your best foot forward in that round. And so you don't want to, again, to use the ammunition metaphor, you don't want to use up all your ammo on the seed. Another timing related consideration, and this is really more a question for your PR counsel, is what does the market for this kind of news look like at any given moment? Because as you said, Morgan, a couple of years ago when it seemed like everybody was raising 9-figure rounds, a $5 million seed just wasn't going to make the news. But then when the funding tap got turned off, you did start seeing more seed rounds show up in the news. So a seed can be more or less interesting to reporters who cover funding, depending on how much other funding news is out there. The less competition you have, the more likely you are to be covered. But that's really something that your counsel can advise you on.
Just to add in, we touched on sort of like using your ammo wisely. I think it's important that folks realize that there's not that many opportunities that you get to talk about what you are. Most of the time, journalists want to hear what you're doing. And so getting funding is something, right? But oftentimes what we want our clients to start thinking about as soon as they're planning their communications around a funding round is, how are we going to follow on that? What are the next stories we're going to develop? Because, that's, I think, what's really key to running a good campaign, for a startup, is finding those bridging stories that will get you to that next funding announcement.
Next question. Is it worth entering Fast Company's World's Most Innovative Companies Award? I think I've got the name of that right, but we all know what it is. The Most Innovative Companies Award they do every year.
I think it is. Not every company is going to be able to make good on the promises of the categories, right? So you have to be an innovative company, right? And just because you work on something digital, or something Silicon Valley doesn't necessarily make you innovative. But it starts putting you on a radar, right? That Fast Company has multiple journalists who take part in that selection process, and multiple awards categories that, can start kind of putting you on the radar for that. You certainly want to win that award. It isn't one of those awards that is kind of like, okay, you handed the money and you're going to probably get something. It is tough. So you got to have the goods.
Along similar lines, most brands are familiar with World's Most Innovative Companies. That is Fast Company's flagship award program. It's the one that, everyone dreams of being in. And it is expensive to enter. It's something like $800 per category you enter in. So it's not a trivial investment, especially for a smaller company. So, if you work with a company with a large marketing budget, they're usually thinking it's no big deal for them to apply in 2 or 3 categories. But for a relatively early stage startup, it feels like a significant investment, especially if the chances of winning are so low. So don't sleep on Fast Company's other awards. Like a lot of publications, Fast Company has introduced an award that is more geared towards earlier stage companies. That is the Next Big Things in Tech award. So if you are an early stage company that is showing great traction, as the name implies, Next Big Things in Tech is partly an innovation award, but partly it's a growth award. This is a case where even if your business might not be as glamorous as, say, like a virtual reality product or something that ticks all the, or presses all the easy innovation buttons, Next Big Things in Tech is worth taking a look at. It's a similar price, maybe a touch cheaper than most innovative companies, but your chances to win are probably significantly greater. And then if you have any kind of public mission or philanthropic side to your business. There are the brands that matter, and especially the World Changing Ideas Awards. Those are two separate Fast Company Awards programs. World Changing Ideas, this is just my opinion, but I think that one is probably more amenable to startups than Brands That Matter, which seems to me, there are so many winners in each of these, but it seems to me that Brands That Matter is tilted a bit more toward larger, glossier brands that are executing really high profile public interest style campaigns like Dove, for instance.
It often comes up. It's just that, because as Ian said, like every company in Silicon Valley is innovative. And so you sort of feel like you have to, even though you know that the chances that you might not win might be low, but there are benefits in doing that. And look at these other categories. Here's the next question out of the bag. There are things on my Wikipedia page I don't like. Can we just change them?
It seems like you ought to be able to, right? I mean, Wikipedia is by nature a collaborative enterprise. It invites the public to freely edit, different entries. But surprisingly, this is a no-no. This is strongly discouraged by Wikipedia itself. It has been since the beginning. And a number of brands have gotten themselves into PR trouble by trying to edit their entries directly. It's actually against Wikipedia policy for someone directly related to the subject of an entry to edit that entry. There is a proper way to go about it, which is to submit a request for edit to the editors who are sort of tending the page. But, that is anyone who goes that route should just be aware that there is a sort of anti-commercial, anti-brand streak that runs through a lot of the Wikipedia editorship. And the founder of Wikipedia said early on, we don't want this to be a directory of companies. We don't particularly care if every company is represented. Of course, anything that is on Wikipedia ought to be factual, but there's not a sort of a pro-brand tilt the way there might be in a lot of other public interest or sort of publicly accessible, globally voluminous sources of information. They don't even want to be the information source of record for the commercial world. So we generally counsel clients we always counsel them against trying to just straight up stealth change their entry, because that can actually cause more problems than it's worth. And then we counsel them that if they're going to, submit a request, then just be prepared for it to be a long drawn out process, and they may not get the result that they want.
Yeah, I think this falls under the category of, can you please delete the internet for us? Having worked at a crisis agency, that pops up a lot, actually, right? It isn't always just Wikipedia. The problem is that there are services, or basically folks out there, who are claiming that they can do this, right? And they're sending emails to corporate communications managers. And so those folks are going, okay, well, maybe this is possible. Mostly what I've seen, it's been of the same sort that were promising, great SEO results 15 years ago by adding Pokemon tags to your page, right? They're probably not going through the proper channels, or they've found access to the channel in a improper way, right? So, I think this gets back to kind of what's the bigger problem that you're trying to manage. And if people are getting an understanding of your company based on your Wikipedia entry, then you probably have to back up a little bit further. Now, if we're talking about things that are absolutely not true, right, then going through the proper channel is what you have to do, and you have to be patient about it. But there's other ways to present your point of view than waiting for the Wikipedia page to update.
Good answer. Now, BlueSky just became public, and Threads has been around for a while. They've sort of been developing that. I think there's a sort of web version of it now. So it begs the question, two parts of this. One, as comms pros, should we be on Threads and BlueSky or whatever the channel is? And then as a brand, as a startup, should we be creating a channel and a presence on those networks too? What do we think?
Well, I've been on both services from the beginning. I think, I'm going to defer to Ian on, or certainly want to get his thoughts on Threads because he's written a whole blog post about it, which everyone should check out. But my gut on this is, having been on both services from the beginning, checking each of them daily, following as many reporters as I can on each channel, I do not see it as a great place for brands right now, most brands. It's interesting to see how the Twitterverse has fractured since the changes at Twitter, now X, and where different parts of Twitter have migrated. What, is often called weird Twitter, sort of cynical accounts, really radically political accounts, a high reach, but mostly satirical accounts, like really sardonic political commentators, have moved to BlueSky. Like that weird Twitter has moved to BlueSky. And cards on the table, BlueSky for me is way more fun than any of the other alternatives out there. I'm on BlueSky several times a day because the content's just more lively, more interesting. Whatever was delightful about Twitter, I'm now finding on BlueSky. Threads, on the other hand, which came out very early and said, we want to be a channel for like big commercial brands. We want to sort of bring that Instagram sensibility to social media, to the Twitter experience. And what we don't want to do is get bogged down. We don't want to become a vehicle for news and political debate, right? So just for the nature of my work and my own personal interests, I'm not that engaged with the Instagram side of Threads. It's really more the relevant, world of reporters on Threads. And I would say that what you see there is the larger corporate media will have their accounts on Threads. So we're talking about like network news, network morning shows, anything that trades on respectability has tended to move over to Threads, which means that the content there is relatively dull. But it also means that for the kind of companies we work with, there's not really a lot of room for engagement. Like they're looking for Threads favors consumer-oriented brands and what I would call like corporate, relatively staid news. We haven't even talked about, say, LinkedIn, but if we had to sort of break it all up, I feel like weird Twitter's on BlueSky, Try Hard Twitter is on Threads, and corporate Twitter, which has a lot of overlap, like professional Twitter, has sort of moved over more to LinkedIn. And I think we're all we could go into what X is left with, but what X is left with, as has been well documented, does not seem like a great place for most brands at this point.
Yeah, I think Chris did a great job covering that off. It's one of those things, in some ways, it feels like somewhat after a catastrophe or something like that, right? Like the infrastructure has been spread out, right? And those things that were sort of balancing each other out, like Chris has said, have kind of emptied into their own little areas. And so I think you need the tension of controversial content being made, of people organically reacting to it. It can't be too safe of a space, whatever that future business-oriented social network can be, right? LinkedIn is, everybody's got their name attached to it. People aren't going to take the same amount of chances, which makes it an easier place to communicate as a business, but it makes it less likely that something's going to really grab hold of people and catch fire. And there's even policing sort of that's not the right content here, when people put things that are too personal or actually are political in nature. There's an opportunity for either a new frontier for X to kind of reassemble itself, which seems less and less likely, or another one of these brands, which is why I think you have to be lurking right now. I'm not going to advocate that any brand needs to be there, but folks need to be listening, whether it's for journalists or for watching. How is the zeitgeist moving? How are people thinking about our world in their most honest spaces?
Yeah. So as PR people, you got to probably be on and still be on all of these networks, because from what I see, the media is spread across them all depending on what they want. And in fact, are still sort of partially in all of these. So if you want to track them, you got to follow all of these. Next question out of the bag is, what is going on at TechCrunch?
Yeah, wow. I mean, a lot of it. And, I'm sure from the standpoint of TechCrunch reporters and editors, not great. We recently had some layoffs where some of their top editors were eased out, Daryl Etherington, Matt Burns, along with some of their newer reporters like Morgan Sung and Hari Weber. Also, the international team was affected too. Catherine Shu, who reported on companies in Asia Pacific, was let go as well. So we're seeing consolidation there of their reporting and editing team. Connie Loizos was appointed their top editor not long before that. She's had a long time relationship with the publication and, been an editor there for years and years, but seems she'll be taking a more active role as their top editor. But it's not just TechCrunch, right? We're seeing layoffs, serious layoffs across the industry. Wall Street Journal just had not long ago some major layoffs especially in their DC bureau.
The LA Times too lost their DC bureau.
That's right.
Insider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost any publication you can mention has been trimming headcount this year to the point where multiple publications, I think, including the New Yorker, just this week run pieces on an extinction level event for the media. Now, I'm sure that's what it feels like right now. I don't know that that's really what we're looking at. But if you're inside the business, you must be thinking about your other options. I mean, it was interesting. One of TechCrunch's former editors, and his name escapes me at the moment, he's now working at a VC firm, wrote a really cogent analysis of the TechCrunch business model and why it just wasn't delivering. And I just noticed that, one of TechCrunch's reporters, Frederick Lardon, sort of said this is spot on. And, in the comments, mm-hmm. I think this was on LinkedIn, in the comments, he seemed open to the possibility that he wasn't going to be at TechCrunch forever, or at least he was thinking, he was just sort of saying, look, under these circumstances, if I'm remembering what he said correctly, under these circumstances, you've got to, you can't blame anyone for looking at other options. And he's been at TechCrunch for years and years, but it just goes to show that, if you're in the journalism business right now, you can't feel like your job is secure. And I think that has important implications for PR professionals as they're, interacting with reporters. I mean, it's been true for almost as long as I've been in the business that every year seems like the worst year for journalists, and that we always tell our clients, bear in mind, these are people under a lot of stress, writing more than they ever have, with less job security and for less pay and fewer benefits than they've ever had. Right. But I would say the beginning of this year is a moment where that sort of ambient level of unease has spiked to an even higher level. As someone who's interacting with reporters, you just have to be aware that that's the backdrop you're operating against.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to Sam Whitmore when Connie was brought on board, and he said to expect more salon events, which is what Connie had done with her Strictly VC newsletter. And maybe that's what we're seeing as they're sort of trying to trim down their roster of reporters. But some of these are very established writers, have been there for, a decade plus. It is a surprise that what was Extra Crunch and then became TechCrunch Plus, the subscription service, I think it was only $100 a year. So it's not inexpensive in the same way as, say, the information is, that a brand like TechCrunch was unable to make the subscription model work when they had lots of great analysis behind that paywall. Actually, a lot of their content was moving behind there. This is a model, the subscription model for reporters is obviously key. You see Platformer, Casey News and Platformer going that way. So it was disappointing, I think, or a bit of a sort of waving the white flag on the subscription model for a brand like TechCrunch, that they couldn't pull that off. Do you think that this means that, when we're thinking about targets, like TechCrunch is still a preeminent, outlet, it's still right up there in terms of a startup's journey, wanting to get their first piece there, wanting to get their news there, etc. Is the star waning, or is this just, look, it'd become a bit sprawling and a bit unfocused, and they need to kind of just narrow back down to what they're really good at. I know certainly that's what Connie has sort of said. What do we think?
Well, I think it was Sam who described TechCrunch as a publication as a sort of an adjunct to their events business. You know, as PR professionals, we often tend to think of it as the other way around. The events business is subsidiary to the journalism. But from a revenue point of view, it may very well be the other way. Disrupt is still, perhaps in its way, even more so than TechCrunch, is sort of a centerpiece of the startup community. I mean, it's kind of hard to judge. They fulfill very different functions, but it is one of the landmarks in the startup field still, despite all the blows that the journalism side has suffered over the years. Based on how TechCrunch is currently constituted, the reporters they have, the editors they have in place, and given that they seem to have rolled up the experiment that was TechCrunch Plus, where they were going to deliver longer form, more analytical content for a subscription fee, I don't know how they could do anything else but double down on what, we think of as core TechCrunch material. Now, I will say that they've kept on, writers like Alex Wilhelm, who was the head of TechCrunch Plus, and, veteran reporters like Ron Miller, who's been doing a lot of his reporting for TechCrunch Plus. So it's possible you'll still see those analytical pieces just come out under the general TechCrunch banner. But I have to think that in eliminating some of those top editorial positions, it means that even more of the editorial responsibilities are probably going to devolve upon the reporters themselves.
I think they also killed off the contributed article program, which has been off again, on again.
That's right.
As part of this, there's no one reviewing that stuff, and they don't want to be. They've had that come and go a few times over the years, and for now it's gone. Here's our next question, Ian. Are newswires worth it?
A lot of times we're asked this, and sometimes it's about we're being asked by folks who are really worried about their budgets, and should I put this one out on the wire? Kind of like Chris said, it depends. One of the things that it helps do is create a moment in time, right? And so for a lot of the kind of outreach that you want to do, for example, if you're giving reporters a preview of a release, you're giving them a view of it, and there's a specific point in time that it becomes official, and using the press release on the wire as that moment can be very useful. It has some residual benefits in the fact that it sticks around, right? Those results are still out there. And when a journalist is doing some research on a story several months later, if your release is of the nature where it's going to be useful to them later, for example, the stats-led or research-led release, it can be a great way to make sure you're picking up that sort of residual interest. On its own, it's not going to be the thing that drives any coverage, right? It can drive some vanity views for those those executives who do get excited to see it on the MSNBC automatically loaded press release page that drives no actual buyer to anywhere. But it can be useful in that regard. It can also be useful for reaching places that are difficult for you to otherwise get your message out to, right? Small publications, if you have a story that maybe it's aimed at an SMB buyer or even a consumer, it might give you that long tail of potential pickups in areas that you're not going to do a direct piece of media outreach to. Geographically can help you at least get this thing on the internet in that region. Again, you're not going to get the Globe and Mail calling you because they saw a press release go over the Canadian portion of the wire, but it gives that reference point. It gives you an easy way to direct people to your story.
Yeah. So not all news needs to go over the wire, and it's not going to be a big driver of news coverage. Also, I'm going to say it doesn't drive SEO. I often hear, hey, you should put it over the wire because it's going to be great for SEO. And at one point, you just get lots of backlinks from that. But Google's realized that, and that gamification ended a long time ago. So, sometimes is the answer. You're right. How many people do we need to survey for it to be newsworthy?
Yeah, I'll take this one. It depends. Well, it does. It depends on how hard is it to find that person that you're surveying, right? If it's a person on the street, if you're just trying to find general opinion, you need more of them. A journalist wants 1,000, will settle for 500. If it's oncologists in the Northeast, you might be able to get away with 100 or 200, right? Mm-hmm. Oftentimes, we see even more constrained groups, right? The C-level isn't going to, a CEO is not going to fill out a survey because they're getting a free iPod. They can afford their own iPod. So acquiring that level of respondent is an investment. So a lot of times you're going to be bound by how much can you spend on this survey, right? An everyman respondent might only cost you $2 a person. That CEO, that might require $150 a respondent. So what are you going to do with that survey? What is its purpose, right? If its point is to drive media interest on a general level, and you can create it on the basis of public opinion, you should create it that way and invest in getting a lot of respondents, right? Again, if this is something that's very specific, intended to influence buyers, right, you might not need quite as many to get a trade journalist to pick it up.
Chris, can you pitch the information?
You can. And it's interesting that this question even comes up now, because for years, the question wasn't can you, but why would you? Right. Because, the information is behind a strong and very expensive paywall. So, most clients where we would even raise the possibility would say, well, nobody's going to see this story. It is a publication that has a lot of currency in the venture capital community. It's aimed at the venture capital community. I mean, interesting enough. So was TechCrunch in the early days. It wasn't about venture funded companies as much as it was about the venture industry at the beginning. And the information did that with a vengeance. But it's really interesting to see how the information has grown and added to its staff and become much more of a sort of a general interest. If you're interested in Silicon Valley, now you want to be reading the information regardless of whether you have a strong vested interest in the venture capital industry per se. It still has that VC bias. It's still very plugged in to the VC community. That said, the question of should I is still a live one. You absolutely can pitch the information now. They've hired reporters from places like Insider and TechCrunch, and a lot of those reporters brought their relationships over from the publications they used to write for. And I think overall, the sensibility of the information feels a lot more like a traditional pitchable publication. However, it still has that sort of investigative journalistic DNA. The paywall is still a real consideration. This is something you really have to sort of hash out with your counsel. But chances are, if the information is a great place for you to be, you kind of already know it because you're plugged in to one of their reporters, or your investors are plugged in to one of their reporters. It still has that insidery feel. And I don't mean Business Insider. I mean like that inside baseball feel to it. It's not a great place, obviously, because of the paywall to get general visibility. It's a place where you can influence the Silicon Valley conversation and make your case for, say, an approach to the sector that you're in, or potentially, if you play your cards perfectly right, a place to make your case for why you're going to dominate your particular sector. But again, you have to be clear that you're talking to an investor or Silicon Valley insider audience. And if you're trying to, say, use PR to speak to potential recruits, it's not really the place to be.
I definitely think it's getting a lot better. It's breaking some news. It's breaking more and more news. It broke all that news about Brex recently and layoffs and revealing its numbers, which everyone was like, okay, this is a real scoop. I think it's come a long way since the days. I think I almost unsubscribed when it was just obsessed with Snapchat and how many articles do we want to read about Snapchat? But now it's broadened its reach a lot more. So you can, but as Chris says, you're talking to insiders in the Valley, and if that's your audience, go for it. But it can also bite you.
I would also add that you're dealing with a very independent news source that isn't afraid to call you out if you don't do communications right. And we've seen articles that are like that in ways that we haven't from others.
That's a really good point. I mean, again, I mentioned offhand the sort of investigative DNA in the publication. And, despite the image or the impression you might get from watching a show like HBO Silicon Valley about how all reporters in the Valley are like really hard-charging, hard-nosed, scoop-hungry types in the mold of a Kara Swisher. The truth is that a lot of the journalism that's produced by the tech publications, Valley publications, is pretty congenial, and collaborative. The publications are, on some level, cheerleaders for the industry. The information has a more traditionally journalistic, aggressive take. They are scoop hungry. They do want to break news. They do want to find stories that are going to be embarrassing for companies in the Valley, because that's going to be catnip for their readership. It's the ultimate insider story. So yeah, handle with care.
Right, I think we've got time for one more, so I'm going to dig deep in the bag here. Will the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times cover my funding story? It's my big story. Can I get in there?
TLDR, New York Times, almost certainly not. Wall Street Journal, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. So Wall Street Journal, you will probably not see it in the general tech section, but there are opportunities to be found in the professional publications, Wall Street Journal Pro publications.
Pro,
like the VC publication, sometimes the CIO publication. The reporters at those publications do overlap a bit with the general tech section. But if you are in an industry if you're in a hot industry, if you can make, like, for instance, if you're pitching the VC vertical, you want to play up some aspect of the funding itself. If you're in a hot industry and there's some aspect of the funding, like maybe a couple of VCs that don't typically work together have come together on this investment, that could be a good fit for that channel. So I would say the way is narrow at the Wall Street Journal, but it exists. The New York Times, it's just not built for covering startups. I mean, you never say never. It's not absolutely impossible, but it's not realistic for most startups. So just count that out. In the heyday of the 9-figure funding round and the minting of the years of minting unicorns, Bloomberg, for instance, was known for, you had a pretty good chance of coverage if you gave Bloomberg an exclusive on your unicorn round, right? And so depending on timing and the landscape and looking, if we're not just talking about Wall Street Journal, New York Times, but top tier business in general, if we're really asking is, will top tier business cover my funding round? It's a low percentage play, but there are possible ways. Again, consult your counsel. It will depend on you. It will depend on the timing. It will depend on the size of the round and the nature of it. There are a lot of ingredients that could potentially influence that. So I would say, don't put your eggs in that basket. Great to figure out some play, try to throw a pass downfield, but also have a plan to get 10 yards on second and third.
Chris, I love all the sports analogies this time through.
It's a Super Bowl hangover.
Right, and worth just mentioning then, so Chris referenced this VC Pro, which is like a sort of that you can subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, but then there's like a second paywall subscription area that is mainly for the venture community. I don't even know the price of that, but most of your audience as a startup are not going to have access to that. Sometimes they move things out into the main sort of paywall area, but it's very difficult to kind of negotiate that. And it's done on a sort of case by case basis. So when we talk about, most of these fundings in the Wall Street Journal are in VC Pro, you're not going to be able to share that, even if you do get that piece out there, you should just factor into your decision making. Great. Well, that about wraps up our Burning Questions show about PR. And Chris and Ian, thanks for your expertise in answering these questions. There's still plenty more in the bag where those came from. So perhaps have another session like this. But if you, our audience, want to have any questions, then please feel free to mail them in. We'd love to answer your questions. You can contact us at firedup@firebrand.marketing. That's firedup@firebrand.marketing. And we will answer your questions next time we have a Burning Questions show. So Chris, Ian, thanks a lot for your time. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Morgan.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/fired up freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening. And until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.